For over 100 years, one truth remained constant on South African roads: European engineering, German precision, Western dominance. Then, in less than the time it takes to pay off a car loan, everything changed. What happened wasn't just a market shift, it was an automotive revolution that nobody saw coming. The speed of this takeover is unprecedented in global automotive history.
I do know a few that are closing down because of the Chinese dealerships that are opening up. We're booming, if I can say that.
With monthly sales of over 1,500 cars apiece, firms like Chery and Haval have seen spectacular development in recent years.
According to the Automotive Business Council's data, Chinese cars are now outselling many traditional and trusted brands here.
But this story isn't really about cars. It's about power, influence, and high-stakes battle for Africa's economic future that's playing out, one vehicle at a time. I am Asongwa Luis, and today we are investigating a transformation that is so profound that it's sending shockwaves from Johannesburg to Beijing to Berlin. And the question isn't really whether Africa's automotive landscape has changed forever. The question is, who really wins when the dust settles? To truly grab the magnitude of what's happening, consider this. Standard Bank, South Africa's largest auto lender, reports that 36% of their current vehicle loans now finance Chinese brands. 5 years ago, that number was barely 5%. Nothing in 150-year car history prepared us for a dramatic shift like this. This Haval H6 SUV outstood the Volkswagen Tiguan last quarter by nearly 2:1. Its manufacturer, Great Wall Motors, didn't even have a proper dealership network in South Africa until 2017. And they are not alone. Chery, GWM, BYD, Jack, DFSK, Omoda, Jetor, names most South Africans couldn't even pronounce 5 years ago, are now dominating billboards, sponsoring soccer teams, and claiming prime real estate in shopping centers. Industry projections suggest Chinese manufacturers could control 40% of South Africa's entire auto market by 2028. Now, let that sink in. From virtually nothing to market dominance in just less than a decade. We are watching a century of established business relationships evaporate in real time. German manufacturers who thought their position was unassailable are now in full-blown crisis mode. But what makes this revolution even more remarkable? This isn't China's first attempt to crack South Africa's automotive market. Chinese brands actually arrived in 2007, only to retreat during the global financial crisis, dismissed as cheap knockoffs, unworthy of serious consideration. And when they were defeated in the markets back then, everyone said, good riddance. No one imagined that they would return with products that could challenge the Europeans. So, what catastrophic miscalculation by Western automakers allowed this to happen? And more importantly, what invisible forces transformed Chinese vehicles from laughingstock to market leader in just 5 years? The answer revealed a geopolitical chess game where cars are merely the pawns and Africa's economic future hangs in the balance. To understand this revolution, we must first of all understand the economic reality facing everyday South Africans. While incomes stagnated, the cost of everything, from bread to electricity, skyrocketed. The middle class found itself squeezed from every direction. This German SUV is about $43,000. The comparable Chinese model is about $21,000. For families already struggling, it's not even a choice anymore. But what our investigation revealed goes beyond simple pricing. Traditional automakers have long operated on old, outdated business model. Advertise a low base price, then charge exorbitant fees for features most buyers actually want. Take for example, most Western car manufacturers would advertise a particular brand, will say $35,000. But when you get there, you discover that $35,000 doesn't include certain features. Now you would be asked to pay extra if you want fancy features. Chinese manufacturers, they flipped this model on its head entirely. Every feature you see is standard. Panoramic sunroof included, adaptive cruise control included, heat leather seats included. And this is fundamental rethinking of value proposition. Western brands sell you a base model and nickel and dime you for extras. Chinese brands give you everything upfront at a price that still undercuts the competition. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. This market disruption coincides perfectly with China's Belt and Road Initiative, a $1 trillion strategy to reshape global trade with China at the center. What appears to be companies simply selling affordable cars is actually part of a sophisticated government-backed strategy to secure economic influence across Africa. The automotive sector is just one piece of a much more bigger puzzle. While Western nations talked about investing in Africa, China actually did it, pouring billions into roads, railways, ports, and telecommunications. The automotive push is merely the visible face of a comprehensive economic strategy. And for South Africans caught between their desire for status and the reality of their bank accounts, these vehicles arrived at precisely the psychological tipping point. There is one thing about South Africans that many people don't know. They are particularly status conscious. Chinese manufacturers brilliantly exploited the gap between aspiration and affordability, offering the appearance of luxury without a premium price tag. But while consumers celebrate their newfound purchasing power, a darker image emerges when we follow the money. This sprawling factory in Eastern Cape Province employs over 6,000 South Africans. It's one of several facilities where Mercedes-Benz has manufactured vehicles for more than 60 years. These factories have provided thousands of jobs to people, helped them put food on the table, send children to school, educate the family, educate the community, and much more. It's not just a job issue, they are a support system for entire communities. Traditional automakers don't just sell in South Africa, they produce here. The automotive sector directly employs over 110,000 South Africans and supports nearly 350,000 additional jobs in the supply chain. Even more critically, these plants export vehicles worth billions of dollars to Europe, the Middle East, and other African nations, making automotive manufacturing South Africa's second largest industrial sector. There is a reason why the South African economy is known as a diverse economy, meaning that the automotive industry in South Africa is very vital to its economic strength. So the auto industry in South Africa isn't just about transportation. It's a cornerstone to South Africa's industrial base, technical skills development, and export economy. Chinese automakers, despite their surging sales, operate fundamentally differently. Nearly every Chinese vehicle sold in South Africa is fully imported, creating jobs in China and not Africa. The Chinese manufacturer Great Wall Motors, which owns Haval, has made vague promises, but our investigation found that any serious manufacturing investment remains at least 7 to 10 years away, if at all that happens. The mathematics is brutal. For every 10,000 imported Chinese cars that replaces locally manufactured alternatives, South Africa loses approximately 50 direct manufacturing jobs and 150 supply chain positions. This creates a profound moral and economic dilemma. Should South Africans prioritize immediate affordability for long-term industrial development? And as this tension builds, the geopolitical dimensions become impossible to ignore. When President Cyril Ramaphosa toured BYD's electric vehicle factory during his state visit in China, the symbolism couldn't be clearer. This wasn't just about cars, it was a visual representation of a shifting global alignment, one where China positioned itself as Africa's primary development partner. What we are witnessing in South Africa's auto sector mirrors China's systemic approach across the continent. Telecommunications with Huawei, infrastructure through Belt and Road, digital services, banking, creating comprehensive economic dependencies that translate to political influence. And unlike previous colonial relationships that exploited resources while giving very little in return, China's approach offers something immediately tangible: affordability and access to goods previously reserved for elites. Where Western powers were seen as extractive, China positions itself as a development partner, even if the long-term implications for African self-sufficiency remain questionable. This automotive revolution reveals a sophisticated form of economic statecraft that Western nations have struggled to counter. Western companies answer to shareholders demanding quarterly profits. Chinese companies, they often count on state backing, and this can be very powerful. This implies they can operate with minimal margins for years to secure market dominance. It's not a level playing field because we are playing entirely different games. But cars represent something entirely different from other Chinese exports. They are high-value, emotionally significant purchases that reshape customer psychology and brand loyalty for decades. Now, everybody can relate to this. When two friends have two cars from different brands, they sometimes have this talk that, hey, this car is better than this car. Imagine someone who buys a Chinese Chery competing with his friend who bought a BMW from 5 years ago. Now, the Chinese Chery automatically has features that the BMW doesn't have. And that person who buys the Chinese Chery for maybe $17,000 would never go back in future to buy something double the price at the same value. I don't know if you're kind of getting where we are going to with this. I have a friend who has a Chinese Haval. Now, the technology that is in the Chinese Haval is far more greater than a 3-year-old Mercedes, for example. The Europeans are living in the past. Now, this revolution in South Africa serves as a prototype for a continental transformation. Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and Egypt are already seeing similar market trends. Now, the question isn't whether this change will spread, it's how rapidly and with what consequences for Africa's long-term economic sovereignty. And for everyday Africans, this creates an impossible choice between immediate personal benefit and uncertain long-term national consequences. Now, faced with these existential threats, traditional automakers and South African authorities are desperately looking for solutions before it becomes too late. Some advocate for increased tariffs on Chinese imports, a strategy already attempted with consumer goods from platforms like Shein and Temu. Of course, protectionism would be an obvious response for most economies, but then that would just be like putting a band-aid on a gunshot wound. The underlying competitive issues remain unaddressed. But such measures face fierce resistance from South African consumers who have embraced affordability after decades of being priced out of new vehicle ownership. And this is very obvious. Why should the working day South African pay artificially inflated prices to protect German corporate profits? Where was this concern for affordability before the Chinese competition arrived? Some traditional manufacturers are fundamentally rethinking their approach. Toyota and Suzuki have introduced stripped-down locally produced models specifically tailored to South African markets and budgets. For most Western car manufacturers, they waited too long to take this threat seriously. The question now isn't whether they can regain lost market share, it's whether they will survive at all in this new landscape. Others are finally addressing the future pricing disconnects, offering fully loaded vehicles with transparent all-inclusive pricing to match the Chinese value. But the clock is ticking, with Chinese firms projected to capture 40% of the market by 2028. Traditional manufacturers face a stark reality: adapt or perish. And just as traditional manufacturers begin responding to this first wave of disruption, a second transformation looms on the horizon: the electric revolution. South Africa's electric vehicle infrastructure remains underdeveloped, but Chinese manufacturers like BYD are already positioning themselves to dominate this next frontier, potentially repeating this market disruption on an even larger scale. For South Africa and the entire continent, these parallel revolutions represent pivotal moments that will shape industrial development for generations. Can the continent leverage foreign investments and competition to build self-sufficient industries? Or are we witnessing a new form of economic dependency disguised as consumer choice? What's unfolding in South Africa's roots isn't just a change in what people drive. It's a visible manifestation of global power realignment, a shifting world order appearing one vehicle at a time. For a continent that has long sought to escape extractive economic relationships, the automotive revolution poses profound questions about development, sovereignty, and true independence. The luxury German sedan that once symbolized success is rapidly being replaced by affordable Chinese SUVs. A transition that feels like progress to the consumer, but carries deeper implications for Africa's economic future. The truth is that affordability without production creates a different form of dependency. Access without ownership simply changes who controls the economic levers. The century of European automotive dominance has undeniably ended. What replaces it and whether it truly benefits Africa's long-term development remains to be written. That story will be determined not by Berlin or Beijing, but by the policies African nations implement and the choices African consumers make in the crucial decade ahead. My name is Luis, and this is the Strategic Lens, where we make you see beyond the headlines. If you believe Africa deserves development models that prioritize long-term sovereignty over short-term consumption, share your vision in the comments below. How should African nations navigate these complex relationships? What lessons can be learned from South Africa's automotive revolution? And most importantly, who should control Africa's economic future? Because one thing is certain, the answers to these questions will shape not just what we drive, but the very future of the continent itself.